Hello and welcome to Varn Vlog, and today I'm here with an illustrious crew from Cosmonaut Magazine and Cosmopod Podcast. We are here with the somewhat infamous Donald Parkinson, Kristen Cowley at Call, and Connor Harvey. And I don't know Connor, but I do know Donald and Kristen going pretty far back. Donald I've known for fucking ever.
Yeah, since probably over 10 years at this point.
Yeah, it is definitely over 10 years because I
Yeah.
knew you before the Mark Fisher piece came out, and that's a decade. So
Yeah, it was the old North Star embracing the infantile days.
yeah, oh god,
Those were different times. Those are different times.
Very different times. And one of the things about those different times, as we were discussing back when we came on to the left, I mean, I'm actually significantly older than you, but we were in the same milieu. And I feel like most of what we did was argue about the Soviet Union, and in very overly simplistic ways. Usually it was either like on one end, you'd occasionally have your Grover Furr, maybe if you were sophisticated, Dominica Lasordo, maybe Frizzo, maybe like a post RCP Kasama brand ML defense of the Soviet Union. Or you'd have their defenses Trotskyists, but they were not like that dominant after the fall. The decline of the USSWP, which was a long and slow decline. And by the time that you and I entered the left, I think the only thing that was that was really representing a kind of like engagement with the Soviet Union that wasn't purely anti-communism was a kind of third campus critique coming from either left comms or from certain kinds of Trotskyists, particularly Cliffites, post-Shachtmanites, etc. And so there was just lots of arguing about that. And in retrospect, when I go back, I've recently, for some nightmare reason, went back and looked at some of the archives of some of those old groups on Facebook and realized like we were all fucking idiots.
Yeah, we were all wrong in so many ways.
Like we were repeating things that totally uncritically. I've done interviews about my understanding of Soviet historiography and realized that like I had super biased sources and my sources were often corrupt. And also when I tried to correct them, I would go and pull from stuff that was probably just as bad in the other direction. And now you guys have done 3 series. You're working on one that you're going to release on the new economic policy and debates around that. You've done a series on the development of Stalin, Marxist-Leninism, Stalinism, etc. You had the unfortunate position of basically making everybody angry with those episodes because you weren't mean enough to Stalin for some people and you were too mean for others. Mean here meaning say things I don't like. And then you did something on the fall of the Soviet Union, which I think was actually pretty good. I liked your Stalin series quite a bit, and I know one thing that you and I share is an ambivalent admiration for Bukharin and for parts of the NEP, but I am ambivalent about some of it. I think some of it, I was reading, actually in a different context, I was reading the Kautsky-Trotsky exchange on terror, and weirdly it was relevant to stuff that Bukharin was arguing about why the NEP was necessary. And also maybe why Trotsky wouldn't have been the best thinker on those issues kind of was obvious to me in that debate. But even in reading that, it was very clear to me like, oh, this is not just, right deviationist tendency. There's something very real going on about trying to keep the peasantry not over relying on terror, etc., to keep the peasantry as part of the coalition. And there are problems with that, but that, in this way I side with Trotsky over Kautsky. To not deal with those problems is to just abnegate the responsibility of revolutionaries, even if you were stuck in an unideal situation prematurely. So Where do you guys want to start on the relevance of the Soviet Union? Maybe talking about the NEP, because that's what you got. That's what your next series is really going to come on. Maybe we'll start there. So, what do you think are the biggest misunderstandings of the NEP?
Well, I just want to start by saying that I think the ambivalence that you described was only intensified by the research that we did, and I think Christian had a lot to say on that as well, because I think we both kind of had this position that the NEP kind of was the framework, was kind of the golden age of the Soviet state, and that if they kind of modified it or tweaked it a little bit, keeping it probably was the best option. But the more we read about it, the more it, shook our faith in that argument.
I can at least say, I remember several years ago, John Moreau and Samuel Farber had Jacobin articles defending the new economic policy. And I remember reading those and being very excited about them at the time. And I remember I posted one of them on Facebook, and our friend Sean Guillory, who has a, Russia podcast as well. I remember he was like extremely dismissive and almost like in reference to the Moreau. And I remember he was like, "Are you fucking kidding?" He was like, and I remember I was like a little hurt by it. I was like, "Oh, what?" It's like clearly this guy's, Sean's like smart, knows his stuff. And I was like, and that sort of opened up, I think, some room to where I'm like, okay, what we need to do generally is stop cheerleading. Period. No more cheerleading stuff, and it doesn't really get it. And it's really what that is a substitute for study. But I was definitely into the new economic policy. Stephen Cohen's book, I think, has a very, very rosy and a little bit quixotic depiction of Bukharin and the new economic policy. But once you read about it, you see, okay, there's these real limitations. And the thing I'll say in general, and I think a lot of leftists would do better, is that you are not smarter than any of these people. You know what I mean? There's no Marx and there's no nothing that you've ever read that's making you somehow like privy to like the golden, fucking chalice that these guys were like too narrow-minded to see or something. And I think probably the big thing with the new economic policy is that like the misgivings I think people have that I think are stupid is that, when people talk about it, they talk about it only on ideological terms. So they'll say, oh, but it had elements of capitalism in it. And, as if that in itself is some kind of like condemnation, and I think one of the biggest ones that really came across to me is that even though there was like an element of giddiness and zealotry in this sort of thing, for someone like Stalin or these people associated with him, it wasn't like they were like excited to confront the peasantry in this way. Even into 1929, Stalin was still kind of defending the new economic policy to certain extents as a framework. These people weren't like designing things. It's like it's really a very, very, very reactive historical situation. You get this everything we've read: Chile, Cuba, the whole Eastern Bloc. We did Vietnam, Cambodia. We've studied Yugoslavia, so many countries. And I think the essential thing that people miss out on is that these regimes are largely reactive. They're generally kind of doing the best they can. And they're really, for the most part, did not figure out like the magic bullet for building socialism. You know what I mean? There just isn't like some kind of like, well, if only they had just done this thing. It's like, no, it's just history doesn't work like that. It's very dirty. It's very messy. And you have to like find some balance between your own morals and your own principles and these sort of grander limitations of history, these grand limitations of material scarcity, of international, markets, of state conflict. And if you don't get any of that, then you're gonna walk away with like a baby's grasp of the import of any of this stuff. Or that's just my 2 cents on it anyways.
So what did you kind of pull away from Bukharin that you found unexpected? Like, because I read Cohen's book and I like it, but I also realize that it is a not quite hagiographic depiction, but it is a depiction aimed at rehabilitation of a tradition that was basically erasing Bukharin's contributions. And so, as a corrective, I think anytime when you have a scholarly corrective like that, the first foray is going to be an overcorrection. Um, and I think we're even seeing this right now with some reevaluations of Stalin, like Dmitry Glacerdo's Stalin, A Black Legend book, which I don't think, I'm just going to go ahead and say it, I don't think it's a good book. But there are things in it that I do think socialists have to deal with. And hopefully over time, and as we move away from these things as like tied to states that have living traditions and their own immediate realpolitik, that we can be more honest about this stuff and more balanced about, our view of what happened, which I do think that largely the Stalin period was a disaster. But I think it was an honest disaster in a lot of ways. The anti-communist narrative about it makes it seem like it was like just a bloodthirsty free-for-all led by, the Red Czar. And I've very long since come away from that not being the case. So I am very interested in maybe what I'm not contextualizing in the MEP. And maybe for our listeners who are those baby communists, and occasionally they do come here. I'm not normally the podcast for baby commies, I will admit that. But let's talk about what is the NEP, what time period are we talking about, and what are the kind of predominant historiographic interpretations of that period. It's a lot of questions, so I'm going to just let you guys free for all. Pick which ones you want to answer.
Well, someone's gotta. I don't want to double talk though. Oh no, Connor, you should do it. Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess I'll just start with the question of what is the new economic policy. So, basically for context, it's the period following, the Russian Civil War, war communism. You basically have this period where, the Soviets are on their back feet. They've just fought a revolution. They've basically been completely reactive for half a decade at this point to the conditions that they're facing. And the NEP is sort of a way in which they try to have a corrective of that. So a more rationally planned element. Obviously, what's important here is when I'm saying rationally planned, I don't mean with recourse to central planning. I mean, they're taking a step back in order to try to build socialism in a way that is reasoned and isn't completely reacting to the circumstances of history. And so what they end up doing is trying to build back a relationship with the peasantry that had been damaged over the course of the Civil War and war communism. So, for example, during war communism, you have this condition of hyperinflation that meant that the Soviet currency was basically useless, and it led to a condition where they had to requisition grain directly, which didn't, for obvious reasons, make the peasantry very happy. At the same time, you have this huge influx of population into rural areas from the cities, because we have to remember that a lot of these urban dwellers, they're maybe a generation removed from living among the peasantry. So they probably have family back in rural Russia. They probably have some sort of ties there. And so they're going back to these rural areas. There's too many mouths to feed with too little to go around. So requisitioning of grain, clearly it's not going to win you any friends amongst the peasantry. And so the idea of the NEP was to eliminate the requisition of grain, to use price controls, tax policy, in order to then an opening up of free opening up of markets to try to use the peasantry as a basis for industrialization. So the idea being that eventually there would be enough of a market within the countryside for industrial goods that then could be fed back into industry and reinvested. I could go into more, but I think like just for the basic answer of what is the NEP, I think I've covered a bit, and I'd want to let someone else talk.
Yeah, I think it's important to kind of talk about what war communism was as well, because you got to understand they basically had what you could call a food supply dictatorship, where there's a total state monopoly on food, basically. And so essentially peasants can only sell to the state at fixed rates. And so, the biggest change really of the new economic policy is the introduction of essentially free market in the countryside. And then in the cities, you also have, markets developing. And the big argument from Lenin is that as long as we maintain state control over the commanding heights of the economy and maintain a state monopoly on foreign trade, and maintain the rule of the working class through Soviet power led by the Vanguard Party. So in a way, Lenin talks about this model of state capitalism before 1917, before they actually take power. And what happens is that essentially through, in a lot of cases, through the necessity of war, for example, the grain requisitioning that was implemented was already kind of being implemented by the provisional government. If you read Lars Lee's books, Bread and Authority. So in a lot of ways, war communism was a war economy, but like the ideological hostility to the market kind of intensified how far they were willing to go down this war economy route, to the point where they start saying, okay, well, this is actually kind of like communism, and with the inflation, one thing that's interesting is that because money was so worthless, trade unions were demanding that factories pay their workers in goods, directly, just give us directly the goods that we're making, so that we can trade them more effectively. And the reality is like this like kind of voluntaristic attack on the market, well, it probably was necessary in order to feed the cities during the Civil War, ends up kind of carrying an ideological momentum of its own. But at the same time, like there's no real monolithic Bolshevik interpretation of this period. That's another thing that is really important to understand is, yes, you have Bukharin's book, The Transition Period, Economics and Politics Transition Period, where he's really kind of putting forward this war communism as actually is moving towards communism thing. Whereas Lenin is a bit more, aware of the limitations of this. And in a lot of ways, Lenin shows a lot of pragmatism during this period, if you look at the real record. But there is definitely a kind of ultra-left current that wants to keep war communism even going and sees the new economic policy as a betrayal. And a lot of this is the rank and file young Bolshevik militants who sacrifice a lot during this war, Civil War, which is just absolutely brutal. It's hard to imagine the brutality and the violence and the misery that occurs during this period. But at the same time, there's this feeling that by bringing back all these what they call net men, all these private middle traders that were essentially giving power back to the bourgeoisie, and all of this sacrifice that we made during the Civil War was really for nothing. And so there's a hostility from the rank and file militant working class towards the net. And later on, Stalin is kind of able to mobilize that towards his own ends through his industrialization policies, which are kind of seen by some as a return to war communist methods, which is interesting.
Well, this kind of always led me to the weird figure that Bukharin plays, because he's like the key, the in some ways post facto leader of the right opposition, is yet for most of the pre-revolutionary and the early revolutionary period up to and beginning through the Civil War, he's actually associated with the left wing of the Bolshevik movement. And I think a lot of his excitement about war communism and then the NEP seems to me actually an extension of this kind of left tendency, but through a means of well, we have to keep the peasants as part of the dictatorship of the peasants and the proletariat, and we have to somehow deal with, quote, socialism in one country, a phrase that, while is associated with Stalin, does have its origins in Bukharin himself. And how to maintain that split, particularly when they're writing in a context where it's not clear yet. You know, I mean, during the very beginnings of the NEP period, it's like, yes, the German Revolution and the Civil War have settled out the immediate prospects of a revolution in Central Europe. But it's still not clear that how far off that actually is going to be. So I think all these things are, you know, at play when we judge that. But I think the point you made at first, that we can't really judge this only through its ideological justifications, is actually very important, right? Understanding what Bukharin wrote and what this actually led to are two kind of separate things. So to turn that back on you, other than also alienating some of the younger Bolsheviks who really were, you know, hard fought and were taking positions well to the left of what Bukharin was seeming to take, and who else was alienated by this policy?
Well, another one of the issues is that the new economic policy really prioritized for quite some time the peasantry, and workers at large were sort of deprioritized in relation to the peasantry. And this was a major concern for the Bolsheviks. You see this especially in 25 and 26, the facing the countryside. And there's really like a kind of a legitimately like almost a pro-Kulak position that's being taken. And for ideological reasons, it's very uncomfortable. I mean, for material reasons, they were kind of the big producers, and you know, it's like there's a really funny issue in socialist history where sometimes the principle and the sort of ideological ramifications starts bumping up against material necessity in a way that the circle isn't always squared. And Bukharin sort of famously has the "get rich" slogan, which almost everybody's like, you shouldn't have said that. And everybody sort of distancing themselves from this. But for clarification, basically Bukharin says to the peasantry, get rich, cultivate your land, you know, go gangbusters out there in the fields. And then, you know, the more food you make, the more you sell us, the more we'll sell you goods. And then everybody goes on happily ever after because it increases production. That's the idea, at least. But there's a discomfort here. And it's like with all theory, I mean, it's almost, I mean, a lot of this reminds me of like kind of a nurture and nature thing, you know, to some extent. There's like, there's features that are, you know, there's, you know, almost like a perimeter set by the virtue of the state being socialist, or this desire for socialism. You know, there's these perimeters set. But within those perimeters, there's a lot of wiggle room. And everybody finds out eventually that unless you have like the scaffolding for a non-market society or something, you have to make certain deals. I mean, even in high Stalinism, the collective farms were allowed to produce their own goods, you know, their own private plots. And there wasn't a choice but to do that. You know what I mean? I mean, this is really the issue. I mean, Varn, you kind of mentioned this. And this is really the issue with a lot of leftists when they're starting off. They're, okay, I'm a new leftist, and I'm uncomfortable with authoritarianism for obvious reasons. And I'm also really intense about getting rid of capitalism for obvious reasons. So the good guys are the people who are really gung-ho about being sort of libertarian, aggressive, non-authoritarian, anti-Stalinist, and this sort of thing, but also against the market sort of to the maximum. And so a lot of people I think are attracted to anarchism or left communism for this reason. But I think on just kind of plain historical grounds, there's just not a ton of room for that in reality. And there's a reason why these tendencies get brushed away pretty quickly. And there's a reason why they don't fucking work out, frankly. You know what I mean?
Right.
You have to have a scaffolding for that. And there isn't one in a war-torn fucking peasant country. And to be honest, I don't know if I don't think there's a world in which you get rid of authority on some level. I mean, that's just kind of getting into the realm of fantasy, you know.
I just want to add real quick. What's interesting is that, you know, the Tony Cliff tradition, even a lot of the left communist traditions, will say that the kind of point of no return to where the Soviet Union becomes like irredeemably state capitalist is like 1928, when Stalin unleashes his 5-year plans and collectivization and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
When in reality, like that's probably the time period when the Soviet Union is the most aggressively anti-market and the most aggressively anti-commercial activity, where you have, very voluntaristic attacks on private trade, where you have basically the closest the Soviet Union gets to essentially abolishing the value form. Like you have at certain points in the 5-year plan, you basically have like rationing, placing markets for basic consumer goods, and it is very quickly phased out because it's realized that it's actually we don't have the means to actually do these kind of economic calculations and do this kind of planning under the existing circumstances, and it's actually not a good policy and for many reasons. But nonetheless, I think it's interesting how the critique a lot of people make of Stalin as a state capitalist doesn't really make any sense, because if you look at it, like the most intense assault on capitalism in Soviet history, maybe second only to war communism, really is the early 5-year plans. And obviously you have the Popular Front, you have concessions to capitalism and the old regime under Stalinism in a lot of ways, but nonetheless, it kind of shows that if you want to kind of just, it doesn't make sense to critique Stalin on the basis that he was somehow like instituting state capitalism.
Yeah, that shit's
you have to critique him on other grounds, and there are many other grounds to critique Stalin, but the kind of cliffite line that this is all about like reestablishing capitalism just doesn't make sense if you really look at what the economics were like and what the history was like.
It would also ascribe some kind of morality to this that just doesn't. It's not like Stalin was like setting out to be a fucking villain. I mean, like it's really easy to get this like sort of view from now and see how these things play out. But it's like, I don't know. I mean, one of, and I'm sorry, I'll after I'm done, Connor, I'll hand it over to you. But like, one of the more intense kind of like revelatory experiences in the Stalin episode that we did was I read James Harris's book with Sarah Davies, I think, or something like this, and called Stalin's World. Is a really good book. But I decided to make a mark on every page where Stalin does something that I thought was reasonable or that I could conceive of myself doing. And then I would make another kind of mark for anything that I thought was really unreasonable or stupid. And I think it was like something like 90 to 10 in terms of, it's like, in terms of him doing sort of reasonable things in the day to day, and the effects of these things are they sort of build up to these absolutely calamitous moments. But it's like, it's often I think it's really easy to misascribe intention, and then you end up with this moralizing version of history where it's like, it doesn't get you anywhere. I don't think it answers any questions, because like you can tell me that it's a degenerated worker state or a bureaucratic centralism or state capitalism, but what have you answered for the next round? What have you proposed that's going to make any kind of difference for the next round? And really the answer to that is absolutely fuck all. You know what I mean? And you only really get that from, I mean, really just reading tons of liberal historians where you're like, oh yeah, these guys aren't really bogged down with all these sort of weirdo Marxoid theories. And they're actually able to tell you a lot more about these places and people without this sort of bizarre kind of almost anti-material moralizing version of history. And it's one of the reasons I think all of us ended up sort of falling in love with these people like Lars Lee and Fitzpatrick. And, they're not communists, I don't think, or not really. But I would rather read them every day of the week than your, bog standard Marxist of whatever sect's version of what happens. I think, it's just a no-brainer to me.
So I have always been alienated by the various like categorizations. One, state capitalism is something that Lenin talks about, but you're right. I've never made sense of when they're claiming the most state capitalists. But so like, okay, collectivizations when you're claiming the state capitalism's happening, like that makes no sense. And particularly since also the policy being pursued is literally the policy from the Trotskyist position that was advocated by Trotsky at that point. Like, it's maybe not the way Trotsky would have said to pursue it, but it is the policy Trotsky would have said to pursue. the other question, you know, we can talk about the purges and the Yezhovchina and all that, and I think there's a lot to criticize Stalin for there. But often I find that like my main criticism of him is bureaucracy plus an inability to control shit. Like he actually is unleashing social forces that he doesn't understand. It's not that like he had like we're going to like eradicate, you know, X number of people. It's more like, well, there has to be like it's Taylorist management schemas that capitalists would also do. And I've seen it with quotas in our society as well. So that's also something where I'm like, well, I don't want to exonerate Stalin's fuck up there because it's massive, but it's also the mistake is not what liberal historians have often tried to do, and definitely not what Marxologists or Marxian historians have tried to do either. So I find that interesting. I also, you know, my favorite thing to do with Stalin is to put Stalin in contrast with Stalin. Like when people tell me they're Stalinist or Marxist-Leninist, I often don't even know what they're talking about because I'm like, are we talking about Stalin in 1951 or 1928 or 1935? Those are actually like there's a continuity there. It's the same guy, but those are different policies, different people, different orientations. The logic for why they exist are different, and it's just bracketed out like there's like some ahistorical Stalin to both critique and to glom onto, you know. And I find that super frustrating because I'm like, yeah, like, you know, I agree with you. Largely, Sheila Fitzpatrick, even a true namby-pamby limbo like Orlando Fig is actually better at a lot of this than me going and reading, I don't know, I'm going to pick randomly that upset people, Ruta Gianskaya or Tony Cliff or even C.L.R. James, people whose politics are in some ways closer to mine, but whose understanding of the Soviet Union seem based off typologies that don't have a whole lot to do with any actual knowledge of Soviet history at all.
That reminds me of probably the funniest response, and you might want to cut. You can cut this out if it's too personal and invective. I remember somebody, I have no idea who it was, got mad at us in our Stalin episode for. He's like, you know, you should have read more Black authors on Stalin, and it said, you know, use C.L.R. James as an example. And basically was saying this from the point of view of being like a Stalinist, with the idea that if you had read some Black authors, they would have really told you how cool Stalin was and this sort of thing. And it's like C.L.R. James is like the only Marxist that I know to call the Soviet Union fascist. You know, it's like it was one of the most like desperate, like, okay, clearly this person is not reading the shit that they're trying to get at. You know what I mean? And then we had a lot of that where people were like, you know, actually, if you had just read this one book that you didn't read, as opposed to the 20 that you did, I mean, it's like that shit was insane. But yeah.
I mean, it's really important to read everybody. I mean, I think for our Stalin podcast, we read a pretty wide array of authors. I mean, we read liberal historians, but we also read conservative historians. Not your like flat out anti-communists necessarily, but you know, like
Richard Pipes, for example.
Yeah. We weren't reading Pipes, but you know, there's certain, you know, conservative historians of the Soviet Union. I'm blanking on their names right now, but anybody who's Neymar, yes, okay, there you go.
He's good. I don't agree with him. He's good,
but he's good. And you have to be able to have those dialogues in order to really get at the history. And I think when we're talking about Stalin, at least on like in online spaces, it's really we're looking at the personality cult myth around him. It's not really Stalin the man. And I think actually the Sarah Davies book that we read on Stalin gets at this the best, that even Stalin was aware of the personality cult around him, and that he was not the person that was the myth that was being made in his own lifetime. This anecdote really stuck with me. And it's supposedly a conversation that Stalin had with his son. And, you know, his son is, you know, speaking of his greatness, right? And Stalin goes, "Oh, I am not Stalin." Basically to the point of the person that Stalin has been made out to be, nobody could ever live up to that. I mean, he's basically, you know, the man of steel, a god among men. And what we were trying to do, I think, in the Stalin project was to give him a fair shake as a human being and like understand, well, hey, why did he make the choices that he made? I mean, and just to tie it back to the NEP episode that we just recorded, no matter what, the peasant question was going to have to be answered. That was very clear by the end of the 20s. It was how they were going to answer it. And again, we can all say the choice that was made, we don't agree with, but a decision was going to have to be made. And so one of the things we were trying to figure out is surveying, like, how would we, or how, what other options were on the table and what we possibly would have done. And I remember walking away from this whole experience saying, God damn, I'm glad I don't have to answer that question now, like, for all time, because I'm not in that situation. But it was a very difficult task that anybody grappling with you're going to make mistakes.
Yeah, I think one conclusion I came to, and we talked about this more in the NEP episode, but I think collectivization was absolutely a mistake. I don't think there's any real economic argument for collectivization being a net benefit. I think what collectivization did was it allowed political control over the peasantry. Collectivization, in my opinion, was done for political reasons, and it had a lot to do with the actual on-the-ground situation of cadres in the countryside who had to put, who are putting, increasingly harsh policies onto the peasantry and dealing with the reactions. And I think, but regardless, I think, Robert Allen in his book Farm to Factory does a pretty good argument that they could have pretty much achieved the same economic growth without doing collectivization. It's really, it was a matter of of attracting excess labor from the countryside. And that was really like what allowed the Soviet Union to kind of like achieve the industrialization, was the fact that I was able to bring all this labor from the countryside and then fully utilize it because they had the full employment policy. So if they had gotten rid of, because during the new economic policy, you had state ownership of factories, but they were still operating by profit and loss metrics. So they still had unemployment and they still were hiring labor at profit. So when you replace that with the quota system, and it's like, well, no longer your job to make a profit. It's your job to fill out these quotas that are increasingly being set above what we know you can accomplish just to get you to put out as much as you physically can, which is another interesting fact. That your incentive is now to employ as much labor as possible, and so you basically are able to create this economy of labor mobilization, and that's really how the growth of Stalin, like the growth that happened under Stalin, was able to happen. And the argument I think that Alan makes is that, like, if you could have done this without collectivization, and maybe you had slightly less economic growth, but the human cost of collectivization doesn't justify the small amount that it benefited, that it contributed.
I think it's you can't justify. I mean, that's like, I think the thing about Stalinism is even when you understand on historical terms, on his terms, even, the dilemmas, there is no excuse for the amount of, with the amount of bloodshed and the effect of these policies, even if he didn't if he didn't think that they were going to happen that way. The fact of the matter is, the reason the right opposition, the reason a lot of, your Trotsky and Preobrazhensky, even though in 29 they were trying to, or they were warmer to Stalin. I mean, the thing is that everybody realized, like, the right opposition realized that this is what was going to happen. I mean, I think they understood that if you go in with the kind of guns a-blazing against the peasantry, you'll get the war. And I think the left opposition, even though they kind of toyed with it in the late 20s, by the early 30s when they backed away from it, I think they understood that that was just not worth it. That there is sort of no excuse for a socialist state to abide over a famine to that extent. That was just sort of like inexcusable, and it's really, really harsh. There's a lot of caveats to that and whatnot. I mean, especially looking at someone like Trotsky, he's like, oh, I wouldn't have done it that way. And it's like, well, you know, did Stalin want to do it that way? I don't think so. You know, it's like no one would have wanted to do it that way, you know? So, and I think, I mean, this is kind of the issue with what I would call a sort of consumerist approach to picking your ideological tendency on the left. Is like, oh, here's a person that says things that I like, you know, and so I'll sort of identify with them, you know, or like even sort of loose ideas. It's like this is, you know, in history, these things, people are contradictory. The real ramifications of the decisions that are being made are really thick and pregnant with deep material reality in a way that like people just don't often consider. And again, the thing that, you know, I really enjoyed about liberal historians is they're not trying to tell you about how Stalin felt, you know. So, or someone like David Priestland, for example, who I think we all like adore, you know, his book on Stalin and Stalinism is great, but it's like he's not trying to tell you, you know, any kind of moral narrative. He's basically saying like these were the things at play, and these are the decisions that are made. And he sort of let, you know, there's a lot of times where a really good historian's like, now why would, you know, this person have done this thing? Well, I, you know, maybe think that it's this, but like at the end of the day, I can only tell you, you know, I can only paint so much of the picture, you know, and that's, you're a lot better off with that kind of thing, I think, than trying to find like a hero to excavate. I don't think that works.
Yeah, I would compare someone like Priestland or J.R. Getty. These are smart liberal historians. You know, I don't even want to really call them liberals because, you know, it's just like, that's probably what they are, but they're not writing as polemicists for liberalism. They're writing as historians. But someone like the three books that people kept telling us that we should have like spent more time on were Lacerdo, Stalin, A Black Legend, Grover Fur, Khrushchev Lied, and all of his other work. And
so the argument about ignorance, the historiography school.
Yeah,
like, not the Lacerdo book, but the Grover Fur books. I'm like, so almost always it's like we don't know what happened, therefore whatever I want to have happened happened.
Like, yeah. And the third one is the Ludo Martins, another view of Stalin. But if you read these books, it's like they're more polemics than actual works of history. Like I would say the Lacerdo one is the smartest of the three, and that it's does have some interesting arguments. Like he does kind of make this argument that the culture of the purges kind of like has roots in the underground wing of the Bolshevik movement and the kind of paranoid culture that fostered, and the purges are kind of a carryover of that, which is an interesting argument. I thought, you know, I could actually see like a liberal anti-communist making like a similar type of argument. But you know, even then, that book is ultimately a polemic. It's trying to kind of convince people that Stalin was actually a pretty reasonable and even at times liberal guy that you know, was kind of a national populist that you know, we should have more respect for as a kind of almost Roosevelt type figure. And Grover Fur's book is basically just like trying to prove that Stalin did nothing wrong. And Ludo Martins, I'm not as familiar with, but it's a similar type of like polemic about just, you know, saying we need to uphold Stalin in the name of the anti-revisionist communist movement.
I have it on pretty good authority that Grover Fur is not ignorant, but knows the sources, but actively works to suppress things that don't actually follow in line with his argument. One of the people on my, I'm not going to say a name, but one of the people on my PhD committee is a Soviet historian and knows Fur, and so I tend to think that he's probably well aware of what he's doing and purposefully doing it. But that's
Fur's a hermeticist, you know. He's like,
yeah.
He's like a monk that sort of like read all of the, you know, I mean, to his credit, he's clearly, even Getty mentions that there's like things that Fur uncovered that like no one had barfed up yet because he like is so obsessed. But it's like he basically captures all this stuff in a bag and then chooses the stuff that sort of that is evidence for a foregone conclusion. You know what I mean? But the conclusion's foregone. And as far as Martins goes, he's Martin's is a total fanatical, zealot. I mean, his book. I mean, I'll tell you what. I mean, after reading Priestland and Harris and all these people, for what, like 6 months or something, and just devouring it, I finally did look at the Ludo Martin's book, and within a paragraph, he's like calling out Titoist, fascist, Zenovists. It's like, what fucking year is this, bro? I mean, it's like bizarre bullshit, and it's like, well, this is not. It's like, in a way, like if you're a historian, you're like kind of a lawyer. You're bringing up evidence, you're trying to make a case, but like, that like something like that. It's like, it's like going to the fucking court of law and being like, oh, look, the other guy is he's a schlub, or he's like, your honor, that my client, he didn't mean to. It's like the weakest fucking goofiest shit that I've come across. I was so, when I looked at that, I was like, I can't take anybody seriously who was trying to get me to read that book. It was just stupid, total waste of time.
Yeah, the Lacerda is the most interesting of those to me because it is in some ways the least historical. It's basically a Hegelian argument, and it doesn't so much. There are historical errors in it, at least from what I can tell from reading Italian responses to it when it was published in Italy, that aren't getting aired in its boosters here in America. But that there's the Lacerda is the most sophisticated in so much that it's not trying to deny a lot of history that we actually have documentation for in the way that, say, Fur might and Martin's definitely is. But I like you guys came to a much more complicated, even just like Priestland and Kotkins were my starting points for really getting into the history of Stalin. And both of them did change my opinion on what I thought was going on. It didn't make me think that the Marxist-Leninism of that time period was any less of a fuck up, but it did let me think that, like, oh, this is not an unreasonable power mad person. This person is brutal in their like practicality in some ways, but more like an average CEO than like a genocidal monster. But these things spiral out of control over and over and over again, and that is the lesson. And to me, it made me both. I don't want to, I'm not a Kauskius of the neo or the classical variety, and I don't even know what neo-Kauskianism is anymore. But it made me somewhat sympathetic to the fears that like Kautsky and Plekhanov and them had about a premature revolution in the first place. Like, I get why they are concerned now, because like I was in that Kautsky Trotsky exchange that I was reading, I was like, Kautsky's critique of the terror is like, well, if you're in a minority position, you're going to have to use terror. That's just the only way a minority can stay in power. Like, and it's not, it sounds like a moral critique, and at moments it does dip into it, but the basic critique is you're not going to have a choice, and it's only going to get worse, and it's going to spiral out of control. And while I don't ultimately agree with the conclusions Kautsky makes from that, I do think that's an observation that's not entirely unfair. Like,
Mike McNair gets into that. I mean, in the Revolutionary Strategy book, which is the first time I ever heard that. Because I mean, it's sort of heretical. You're not supposed to say that. You know what I mean? But that book kind of goes into this thing where it's like, well, was it premature? And I think, I don't know. I mean, it's not for me to say, but I've definitely entertained this myself. Absolutely.
Well, I think, the problem with Kautsky's position at the time is that he essentially was scabbing on an actual revolution, as imperfect and complicated as it was, in a moment where it really did need all the help it could get. And it's like, well, is it premature? Well, perhaps if, the international proletariat doesn't come to his aid, then that's what it will happen. And by sitting around, crapping on this entire revolutionary movement that's happening and trying to distance yourself from it in every way, and you are essentially like, keeping the workers' movement in Europe from coming to the support that the Soviet Union needs. Which doesn't say that the Comintern also made a lot of major errors. I think the way that they tried to like force a split between revolutionaries and reformists, rather than like trying to win over the entire Zimmerwald left, kind of was a mistake, I will say. I mean, and that goes, a lot of that has to do
on the 1918 program is, I think
right, and I think where it was done the most
problem.
poorly was in Italy with Bordiga and the PSI. Like, I think the way that the split with the Italian socialists was kind of instrumentalized by the Comintern, ended up kind of putting the communists in a position of being this kind of minority. And, but, we can talk all about, whether it was premature or not, but I don't see anything else happening historically other than some kind of revolution. And I think that Lenin's initial plan, when he's talking about a democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, I think that the closest that you have to that program being enacted really is basically the new economic policy era. Like, that is probably the closest that you get in Soviet history to the actual original Bolshevik program.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it's like, we're going to do the tasks of the democratic revolution, but the proletariat is going to lead it, because the proletariat is the only class that is actually has in its interest to fully overthrow the czarist autocracy and implement a real sovereignty of the masses, And so, how it goes after that, the labels you want to put on it are more and more difficult. But I guess we're kind of going back to that. But I think that is, the closest that, the Bolsheviks were to their original vision. And so I think if, war communism didn't happen, maybe a lot of the more like reformist socialists might have been more willing to get on board with it, because war communism did kind of create this like image of, these Bolsheviks aren't caring about the material preconditions for socialism. They're just trying to rush into communism in this backward country, and they're just going to recreate Asiatic despotism. And, there's a lot of weird Orientalism in some of these arguments as well about how like, they're just going to recreate the Mongol Empire, I think is like one of the mentioned.
Mongol and the Ingans are the two get mentioned all the time.
Yeah. There's this kind of argument that you're going to like just revert to like tributary despotism, which is kind of what the bureaucratic collectivism argument is. Whereas I think what really ends up happening is like it's an alternative path to industrial modernity is what kind of develops, and it's a path to industrial modernity that is not being it's not done through commercialist methods. It's being done through this kind of centralized command state.
Well, I mean, this kind of leads to a paradox of one of the things that by the time we get to the 50s, that the Soviets and then later on the PRC are really good at is basically national liberation revolutions that end up being bourgeois revolutions, no matter how you parse it. That's not a bad thing. It's just, it seems to be what they were able to work out a model for that got you not subjected to the great Western powers when you did it. And it was effective, and it is absolutely, actually. Particularly by the time you're dealing with it in the 50s and 60s, and like kind of like taking the kinks out and talk about like how to incorporate different groups and not have to do all these massive suppressions and whatnot. But it is also true, and this was, when I was more sympathetic to left communism, this was my sympathy base, is that they didn't end up in most cases being socialist states, even by their own standards. And that is a problem. Whereas the more I studied the Soviet Union, and I was like, if this is your model for what state capitalism is, I have no idea what doesn't meet it, right? Like, because at certain points you don't have market relations consistently throughout the society. Sometimes you do. You don't have, like, even when you talk about like state capitalism in contemporary China, which I think is a much stronger argument, where like the state owns businesses, but only as like an ownership partner. It doesn't actually, like, when the Soviets ran firms, they ran them. Like, it was not, it was not like co-ops and partial things and like just government majority control on a traditional bourgeois board of directors. It wasn't any of that. And so I've always been kind of struck about the state capitalist argument. Bureaucratic collectivism, I just don't know what it means exactly. Like sometimes it feels like Orientalism. Sometimes it does describe a development of a nomenclatura class that has a lot of power. But one that was not completely uncontrolled, because one of the things, if you take the bureaucratic collectivist argument seriously, then you kind of should actually like Stalin, because the group he's terrorizing, himself, like the people he's targeting, not the people that are getting caught up in purges in the greater society where you just have social forces unleashed, right? Is the nomenclatura. It's like it's the skilled laborers emerging from the Bolsheviks and the working class and the prior intellectia that exist in society. That's like the way that they controlled them during, and I think this is a bad way to control them, but it's terror. Then that seems to be the only thing they have. So that's a problem. But like, if you don't have any other means to tie them into the project, I don't know what else you do. And to bring me back to the Kautsky point, like I said, I'm sympathetic with Kautsky until I get to the point where Trotsky says, but what are we supposed to do? Are we just supposed to betray the revolution because it's too early? I know it's too early. Like I am well aware of the fact that this was not supposed to happen here by ourselves. Are you going to get on board and have your revolution so we can finish this? Like, what are you going to do? Because until you do, yeah, sure, you're right, doesn't mean anything. And I'm not going to betray the people who put us into power. Like,
it's like you can tell your boy all night not to get too drunk, but once he's shit-faced, it's like you gotta take him home, make sure he's get water next to him. It's like I think that's your if that's your boy, then you got to make sure he's all right getting back. You know what I mean? It's like in all the moralizing, whatever that save that for later. It's like this is like a process, and leaving a revolution like hanging out to dry like that's very tricky. But you also have like an opposite case, okay, like Paul Levy or somebody who's sort of I think making a very prescient call that the sort of like March action type politics is going to fail, and then it does, and then he's vindicated, and then he's like, told you, and that's enough to get him.
Well, to clarify real quick, March action is in 1921, the Communist Party of Germany decides to launch an armed insurrection, basically, without any real mass support from the broader working class. And what happens is you just end up with a complete failure. It gets shut down by right-wing Freikorps, the right-wing militias, and you have social democratic and communist workers fighting in the street. It's basically a total disaster. And there's this whole thing called the theory of the offensive, which is this idea that we need to like launch offensive like actions to like shake the workers out of their Menshevik slumber and get them to wake up to the reality of the world revolution. So, this is like the ultra left Bela Kun wing of the Comintern is pushing this kind of politics.
Luckily, I think if you were to push that kind of thing now, you would get called a Fed, regardless if you were or not. I think there's a very healthy skepticism of that kind of thing, and that's I thank God for it. I mean, could you imagine if you had people on Twitter advocating for that kind of shit? I mean, it would just be a nightmare.
Yeah, but I mean, during 2020, you had a lot of people saying
stuff.
It came and
went. It came and went. Thank God it did.
But I've seen I've not that level of like revolutionary mania, but you do see it pop up in times of struggle and times of crisis. People, they start thinking, it's time to get a gun. It's time to prepare for the armed struggle. You
got to be so careful. I mean, I think this is where the classic Marxist strategy, and I think Kautsky has a lot to say, but really it's not just Kautsky, but it's fucking August Bebel and all of them from those early days, which is, okay, if revolution is, I'll put it this way. It's thinking about the dynamics of history and society on like scientific terms or on like kind of common sense terms, which I'm sorry, but if you're like, talking about having a Maoist uprising in the mountains of North Carolina or whatever, then you've forgone that, haven't you? But like, but it's like they talk about these things on the terms that you would if you were a general or something. Okay, you're going to go into battle. Well, then you will make sure that you have as many people on your side as possible, and you have to do that by showing them that you can be a responsible governor of their interests, and having them have, buy-in. And it's like a basic kind of like functional understanding of like social movement, you know what I mean? And it's like that goes such a long way. It's like, okay, why were people in the Eastern Bloc like kind of happy or ambivalent to see communism fall? And I think it's largely because they didn't have any buy-in. They didn't think that those states like represented them. You know what I mean? That's kind of obvious, but it's like you can use that very simple calculus to, I think, have a functional understanding of how like democracy and mass politics works. The same reason that Cuba is still around, other than also just being an island and these sort of things. But you have a kind of more responsive relationship between the state and its people, to the extent that it's capable of doing that. And it's just like, I mean, a lot of that stuff is like total common sense. And I'm sorry, but I think a lot of that comes from the fact that most people get into leftism from what? Going to college and going to all the stupid people classes and learning all the stupid stuff, and by which I mean like a little bit too much of your theory stuff, and then it doesn't ground you. I mean, all it's it's kind of funny. I mean, I can at least speak for my parents. They were always sort of bullying me for being lofty minded about socialist stuff, and I was always had these like lofty kind of conceptions of how things were done, and they made fun of me, and they were right to, because my ideas were like a little flaky, in terms of what I understood to be the limitation, the material reality of the world.
Well, it pushes you to sharpen your own ideas,
Yes,
and
exactly.
I like that. I like talking to anyone who pushes me to sharpen my own ideas.
Exactly. I mean, that's the reason I got into all this stuff, is because I mean, for years, I just get in arguments with my uncles every year. And then finally, I just read so much that they wouldn't argue with me about it. They'd be like, what do you think about this? And I'd be like, well, in 1935, Stalin, it's like, and you end up, and you sort of like, at that point, you're not even arguing anymore. You're just having like a discussion. And I think that's kind of what we're trying to get at, is that like, this is trying to get at something a little bit like of a deeper understanding of this stuff. Because I think if you don't have a deeper understanding of this stuff, what does it tell you about the future? Like, what does it tell you about your own time? How are you gonna, like, perfect example? I mean, I've been reading, you read like capitalist writers writing about crypto or writing about the potentials of technology and stuff. And when I read that stuff, I go, oh, these guys are experiencing the zealotry of like youthful commissal collectivization type stuff. I mean, it's like that same, it's the same kind of like youthful, invigorated zealotry that you just find it everywhere. And Varn, you mentioned this, and you're totally correct too. And our dear cosmonaut comrade Amelia mentions this quite often, and I think, again, completely correct, which is that like a lot of the excesses of Stalin you find in every large industry in the United States ever. All the Gilded Age capitalists, when it comes down to kind of terror, when it comes down to dog eat dog survival, when it comes down to the praise. I mean, there's a lot of, you can find songs written about like, the Gilded Age, Carnegie and these people, that were like in, the Walmart song and this sort of thing. It's like the cult of personality. It's all in there. I mean, these are the kind of trans-historical things. And like, I think as Marxists, it's not our job to just say, well, they existed then, therefore it's bad, but it's to say, okay, how are these dynamics, how are we going to be able to mitigate and work through these dynamics in the future? And I think that's really the interesting thing is, okay, what about planned economics can we glean, and how do we take this and like look into what's possible right now? You know what I mean? And I think anybody that's like, I've gone really weary of these people. You come across people who are very, 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 very confident, and you talk to them and you realize that they haven't read as much. And I think a lot of people's confidence is entirely confidence in their very particular beliefs is a total, direct connection to their ignorance, and I think
it's very Dunning-Kruger.
Yeah,
actually.
yeah, exactly. And reading this stuff has been so humbling, you know. Like a lot of my like, you know, fucking braggadocious convictions have really been pilloried. I mean, it's almost like a crisis of faith that you have reading this stuff. I mean, seriously, but it does make me hopeful. You know, makes you want to read more. You know.
I mean, it's made me much more circumspect about the Bolsheviks, about, and I've been, you know, on both. I had a very Trotskyist informed opinion. I mean, I was never formally a Trotskyist, but I was in a post Trotskyist organization. The very Trotskyist formed opinion is like pre 1928 Bolsheviks did nothing wrong ever. Post 1928 Bolsheviks utterly bad, reprobate, totally destroyed everything good about the left. Like, then I went through the reaction to that. Actually, not so much studying the USSR. I studied China, and that's sort of where I get my, and it's even more mixed, honestly. Like if we want to talk about like trying to make a difficult situation clear being very hard to do in hindsight, and definitely you can't do it off of just the ideological written records that you have, particularly some of them are like speeches to barely literate peasants. It's you can't really do that with China. And you come up with a very complicated like view of like, okay, well, I get why Stalin chose the KMT, but I also get why that actually leads to the Sino-Soviet split, even though they're going to blame that on Khrushchev, even though that's clearly not actually the reason, because the origins of that go all the way back to the 1920s. Like, and that while I kind of see where China would feel that way, and I think it's legitimate, what they end up doing actually in some ways accelerates to like the collapse of world communism, like as much as anything the West did, honestly. And like, you know, this having a simple narrative about who was right and who was wrong, and whether or not Khrushchev was historical nihilism. And look, you know, I do think some of Khrushchev's condemnation of Stalin was to avoid self-incrimination, like, frankly. But, you know, the Chev is still up there in my favorite communist leaders, and I know I think I'm wildly unpopular for being a Khrushchev stan, even though I also am ambivalent about it. Like, it's not like he was a great leader. It's just
You're in safe company, Varn.
Yeah,
we're all Christianites here.
yeah. I'm like Khrushchev was okay, but nonetheless, it is it's interesting to me when I came to China. So after dealing with the complications of China, and even something like the Cultural Revolution, which I had a very simple narrative of until I really studied it, and like, oh my gosh, like it's not like a lot of the stuff that I thought was bad did happen, but like what's actually going on in there is far more complicated. And I'm only hearing, even from Chinese sources, I'm only hearing one side of the story. And realizing that made me go back and review pretty much everything. Like there are some real villains in Soviet history. Like I do consider Beria a real villain. I'm not, I can't in most circumstances go like, oh, Beria was just operating under the times. No, he was a child rapist. Like he's awful. But I do have to think about what conditions would cause that kind of person to be able to get that far in the party. And are they just the fault of bad actors? And the answer to that is no. Like, that's something you always have to keep your eyes out for, particularly in moments of chaos and civil wars. Those kinds of people will emerge, and they come from multiple class origins too. I wish I could say they were just the bourgeoisie, but they're not. So it's something that we have to look out for. But I think it's really interesting that the study that, you know, the early Soviet Union, in some ways, the late Soviet Union is an easier story, just because it's clearer to us. We have more documentation. It's not under the fog of war. And it's also clear that the early Soviet Union really made Western powers afraid. We might complain about Brezhnev in the late Cold War, but Brezhnev and Gorby did not really scare the West. Like, that's pretty clear. So it's an easier story. I think it's still one that maybe we should dive into sometime, about like what was actually going on in the late Soviet period. And I think I think Gorbachev is a much more mixed and like I have come away from studying him as I see him as a tragic figure more than a villain. But nonetheless, you know, it's a 90-year history. That's another thing about Soviet history. It's just, unfortunately not very long. And yet I am always amazed by what I don't know about it. Like, and that's when my approach is just finding all this stuff out. And I think I too have been moderating my positions. I've become I will admit this, I've become a lot more distrustful of Trotskyist narratives. Even though that's probably the historical position closest to where I emerge now, I'm still, a lot of it seems more self-serving than people realize. They also make huge mistakes. You know, there's a reason why no one talks about what the Trotskyists were doing in the beginning of World War II. Like, not because they were off actually siding with Hitler. They weren't doing that, but like, they weren't defensists then. Like, that's weird. You know, stuff like that. So I think those histories, I also think our history of the left opposition and of the left communist are inordinately cleaned up. And that's something I've learned.
Priestland gets into that I never put the connection together, but he basically draws a pretty straight line between, well, he has this like kind of quadrant of understanding Bolshevik ideology, and then so he's got like, you know, kind of a populist versus a more bureaucratic, you know, approach, and a well, geez, you guys might have to help me. Was it sort of populism
versus technicism, right?
Yeah, technocracy, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then there's two other quadrants, which is basically what it's not market, non-market, but it's like a kind of maybe it's like a relationship between like the amount of authority or democracy that's used. I can't quite remember. I was just sitting here saying
it was, well, you had like a kind of authoritarian mobilization, and then you had mobilizationism, then you had a more kind of like democratic bottom-up mobilizationism, then you had a more technocratic but liberal politically approach versus a more technocratic but like you know, basically military top-down style approach. And there's obviously no one figure consistently stays in any of these categories. It's all these different approaches end up being used by Stalin in different eras, which makes it even more fascinating.
That was what was so interesting, is that like looking at, so I'll put it this way, like if you're like, you know, sort of a kind of a libertarian kind of anarchist kind of conviction or something, it's like, okay, I want no market, but I want a certain amount of like freedom or something. It's like, okay, well, most people are still going to engage in certain kinds of activities, and there's like, who is going to tell them they can't do that? You know what I mean? At some point you get to like the socialism in great part is a juridical scheme. You know, that's kind of the whole thing. It's like, okay, if we want to have you know, a non-market exchange of this sort of thing, like there's a lot of market activity that is pretty just you know, it's gonna happen, or people do it, especially they're gonna do it in times of war, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So okay, who is going to, you can't both have like a libertarian socialist regime and a kind of a front against the market in this way. I mean, like, in what world is that possible? So
Trotsky gives the classic example of like, you want to you know, get rid of the market. You want to have free access to goods, okay? Mm-hmm. But it turns out that you can't produce enough goods to have just total free access, you know, X good to have total free access to it. So you have to ration it. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, it means that ration lines form. Okay, and what does that mean? Well, it means that you need a police to keep the ration lines from becoming disorderly. Yes. And so right there, you see, you know, the problem is like, and so the scarcity means that people have to wait in ration lines, and that means black markets pop up. And how do you control black markets? So you have to have political repression. And so, you know, it becomes obvious that like, it's not a matter of pure political will. You have to actually develop the material infrastructure that allows you to do something like having free access to a certain good.
Well, I think I don't know if you guys feel this way, and maybe this is like a little bit of exaggeration on my part, but I found that a lot of these issues like a lot of these issues, to be aware of them, to get turned on to them, you have to be a Marxist, or you have to be in the water of Marxism and stuff. But I don't think that necessarily solving them is like Marxism alone, or even for the most part, is not going to get you there. You know, I think there's like a part of me like seeing these same sort of dilemmas open up in different societies, in different places, and Marxists and capitalists alike not really having these various kind of like ways of dealing with them or something. It's like at a certain point, I'm like, okay, then it's not that we need a new theory or something. It's not. I don't think it's like as simple as that. But I do think that it's like in a lot of places I was like, well, I don't think being a Marxist is really helping me with these particular set of problems. I think, like in a way, there's something deeper at hand that requires a deeper like engagement. And it doesn't help that like a lot of the major Marxists have like kind of flimsy, goofy, very surface level readings of some problems. And it's like, okay, well, to what extent is like, you know, it's like you know, we have to like even dig deeper into this stuff, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. And I feel lucky that even though I have spent time in sectarian organizations, that I never really fully like imbibed any one reading of Soviet history. So going into this project, I've really just been really open-minded to it. Just like I also feel lucky in a certain sense that I came into, or I was educated in the Marxist tradition by someone who was connected to the living tradition. Like, so just like a little background, my mentor in my MA program was down in Chile during the revolution. He was an American going to, you know, basically support and also study the revolution, and ended up getting tortured by Pinochet's brutes, you know? And so like there was and then his teacher was Ernest Mandel. So, but I never really got the full Mandelian Trotsky view. He basically told me to study history. He said, don't waste your time with too much Marxist theory, study history. That's going to do you much better. So, you know, like this project for me has been really enlightening. And I think the biggest thing that I've come away is that I don't think any of us is going to fully have the answer as to what happened. I mean, even the people living at the time couldn't fully grasp what was happening, let alone us sitting here from 2023. And I think what we can do is look at the questions that are important. And I think one of the things that I came out of the NEP experience was, you know, both on the one hand, you get this caricature of the NEP that it was, you know, basically a complete opening up of markets, and that, you know, it was basically a free for all, you know, like Christian alluded to earlier. Oh yeah, you know, peasants, you know, get rich. The reality was the amount that markets were actually opened up was basically in the retail sector alone. So that was where your net men were coming from. It was in retail sales, not even in wholesale sales. Those were still controlled by the state. Now, you know, you can get into the fact that, you know, opening up those retail markets also then put pressure back onto the state. But, you know, needless to say, it's a lot more complicated than a picture than you often get. And then on the other end, you know, when people start to talk about the following period of collectivization and then the first 5-year plans, well, you know, you get the sense when you hear people talk that planning was far more sophisticated than it actually was. But when it really comes down to it, I think, Varn, you alluded to it earlier, it was basically a Taylorist quota scheme. It was basically, you know, we need 3,000 tons of steel. Let's set our production quota at 6,000, right? Like, it was not like this fully instantiated system where they were getting information from the populace and they're getting information from this widely distributed network. Basically, it was very, very crude. It was a blunt object that relied on terror. And I think I want to tie back to the question of terror that we talked about earlier. Part of I think the issue that we've seen come up time and time again, especially when we want to talk about the collapse of the Soviet Union, is that early recourse to terror is in a way what dooms the Soviet Union to the path that it followed, because there is the sense that once the terror went away, for a few decades you had the memory of the terror, but which was enough to keep discipline. But then once that starts to fade, that is when you really get into this period of stagnation, and where when you look at cultural studies of the 70s and 80s in the Soviet Union, this like real sense of fatalism and nihilism that comes up, because there really isn't an idea of where are we going to go from here. So I think like just to go back to this is, I think we really need to be thinking about these questions and getting to the root of the matter as much as we can.
I think that's actually a fair place, and maybe a fair place to stop. One of the things I think that we have to deal with as we pivot towards this, I've been recently, I want to respond to someone who said being a Marxist doesn't always answer these questions for you. And I'm like, the more I study Marx, and I think what I have done to Marx, what you guys have done to the Soviet Union in some ways, is like going into every fucking letter and like figuring out this position, trying to correlate it, not just with what he said, but like where we are in the international, who are we debating with, what's this center position to, because it's almost always a center position where Marx is triangulating dialectically between two other positions that he views as the outer edges of acceptable opinion, and coming up with like, and there's certain things that he does not answer. You guys are going to eventually talk about national policy in the Soviet Union, and national policy is one of those things where like Marx and Engels are frankly all over the place. Like they are, like there's no way to get around that. Like I was even trying to like write down why Engels considers the Slavs a non-historic people, and then compare them to the Irish and go like, well, no, they're like, I don't see why one is here and the other's here, other than like you want them to be for immediate political purposes. Like there's not actually a good guideline here for what we can consider a valid national policy or this and the other. And so when people go return to Marx, but then they think they already have the conclusion, it's more like, well, return to Marx so that you can say that you have a conclusion that probably isn't there, right? Like that we actually still have to think a lot of this through. There aren't great guidelines. I mean, I still go back and forth between the debates between Bauer, Stalin, and Pannekoek, and sometimes I'm with Pannekoek and sometimes I'm with Stalin. I'm rarely ever with Bauer, because the Bauer answer seems to create all sorts of internal problems and divisions within the working class. And I find it interesting. And then I go back and read, I've recently gone back through State and Revolution a couple times and realized Lenin's also good doing this. Like the number of times where he's like even making concessions, like, yes, these infantile left-wing communists in the Netherlands are crazy, but there's certain things in which they're right about here, and here. I know that sometimes Donald doesn't like that text, but like, there are things about that when he's talking about the nature of the state and like what you're asking people to do. And this paradox that Chris and Connor both mentioned, where people want like the controls of limiting certain kinds of organization, particularly organizations that would feel natural to people because they already exist, like market relations, but there's all kinds of ones. Like people fall back into semi-feudal relations and stuff too. And you having to foreclose that. Well, you do have to foreclose that in times of stress by prohibition, and that's going to involve some variety of force, which means you have some variety of state. And that's why, you know, I do think that's why Marxists are like, yeah, well, we can probably get rid of the state at some time, but we're never gonna like. The promise is never unalienable, you know, no authority ever. That's one thing I want to like point out. That's Marxists are like, Lenin, when writing on the state, never goes like, well, we're gonna never have authority. He seems to think that the people will just become an authority, like popular consensus will be an authority, but we're not there yet. Like,
well, I think, you know, one thing that reading all this stuff and studying the terror especially, and it's convinced me, is that, you know, and this might, I'm probably gonna get some flack for saying this, but I mean, me and Christian have talked about this a lot too, but there is a merit to small L liberalism, in the sense that you do need to have protections of individuals from abuses of the state power. That there is a need for this concept of people possessing certain rights that provide them with protections from arbitrary abuses of state power. Like, I don't think we can move past that idea. You know, I'm very conflicted on this, because I don't want to give too much to liberalism. I don't want to concede too much to liberal ideology, but I do think that you need to have this concept that people should have protections from arbitrary abuse of state power does have merit. Like, people should have right to a trial, for example. You shouldn't be able to just shoot someone without a public trial. Personally, I'm for abolishing the death penalty entirely, which, you know, the DDR, for example, did do in the 1970s, but, you know, there are other abuses of state power that happened regardless. And I think, like, in a lot of ML theory, the idea is like, well, as a dictatorship of the proletariat, there's no separation between the proletariat and the state, because the state represents the proletariat's interest. So therefore, there's no way that the individual needs of a citizen can go against the needs of the state. But the reality is that Lenin actually does concede that this can happen in his debate with Trotsky on the trade unions in the 1920s. He actually argues that the trade unions should maintain a level of independence from the state so they can defend the workers' immediate interest from, you know, the broader decisions of the state. So there is you know, Lenin does basically admit that the interest of the dictatorship of the proletariat, or the, you know, the decisions of the state, can go against, you know, the individual needs of the worker, and there should be protections of those individual needs and rights. I mean, I think this isn't developed enough by Lenin, I don't think, but there is, I think, a need for that kind of small L liberalism. And we don't have to call it liberalism, but that's just kind of how this idea is academically referred to, is, you know, this idea that people have rights, you know, and that you can say that this is a metaphysical idea, but I mean, it's the basic argument that people need to have protections from arbitrary state power, I think, is pretty hard to argue against.
Well, I mean, even all the Soviet response to this is just say the thing that you like and put the word socialist in front of it to kind of legitimize it more. But like, socialist legality is, you know, the word that you get from Bukharin a lot, or even like in the, you know, the social market, you know, you get these kind of like funny things where like no one wants to say what they mean because they don't want to pin themselves up, you know, into a corner. But like, I think, I mean, if you're going to have a revolution, you know, you have to be serious about that and all the things that come with it. And that's not a pretty picture all the time. And I think if you know, if you're going to do war communism, then by God, do it and execute the people and all this stuff, you know, whatever you have to do. There's a certain historical place for that kind of thing, as regrettable as it is. But once that is over, it has to be over. You know, and if you're serious about democracy, then you have to be serious about democracy. I mean, another Cosmonaut episode that I was on that you guys weren't was talking about Czechoslovakia, and the extent to which they could not square the circle of wanting both democracy and legality and all this stuff and socialism. You know, it was really tough. I mean, you really got the feeling that Dubček and these people were just absolutely struggling to figure out a way through these things. And I think their burden is our burden, you know, to this day, which is like, you know, what is a planned economy? Really, what is it? You know, beyond just kind of abstract principles. You know, what really do we mean by democracy? What really do we mean by cooperation? what really is it's like this shit is very heavy, and it's really I mean, I would just caution people to be a little bit more thoughtful when they talk about these things, because it's a lot of it gets pretty deep. It's one of the reasons I also like
Right.
really like to engage with like liberal economists and stuff too. I think there's just there's a lot out there that you can learn from. I mean, I've been reading Adam Tooze and people like that, and I think there's just there's no reason not to engage with this stuff critically. You should engage everything critically, obviously.
Yeah, I will say this, that I think like orthodox hardline ML ideology is pretty much a dead letter, and I don't see much of a future for it. I guess some could argue that China is going to return, or is returning to, a kind of like hardline ML stance, but
I'm skeptical.
I'm skeptical.
Yeah, I'm very skeptical.
I think it's China's a whole other can of worms. I need to do more research on China, honestly, to talk about it with any real confidence or authority, just because.
The more research I do on contemporary China, the more confused I am about what.
Right.
Yeah. Like,
but I do really think that like the orthodox hardline kind of Marxist-Leninist ideology is its own worst enemy.
What I have my theory about why that exists, Donald, is that it's a reaction to both like the anarchism and movementism and later left communism of the aughts and early teens after Occupy, and also frustration with the right and center right of the DSA.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. And I just think a lot of people turn towards that kind of ideology because they realize they've been lied to about communism. So they kind of just embrace the other extreme, which is like the most, everything that historical communism has ever done was correct. And we just need to, there's the whole theory of historical nihilism that if we are too critical of Stalin and reject Stalin too much, then we're just, destroying the whole ground that we stand on. But I don't, the ground we stand on has already been kind of broken with the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yeah,
so.
It seems weird to be dying on that hill after the Sino-Soviet split and the
right, exactly,
the marketization of most of the former communist countries. It's real hard for me to be like, and Khrushchev saying a mean thing once is why everything fell apart. I mean, the other part of me is like, oh, but it's okay to have historical nihilism towards the entirety of the USSR after 1952. Right. Like, come on, like, but it is. I mean, I think we're in an interesting time period where we can learn a lot from this time period, and we can learn even a lot from the Cold War, but none of it is going to speak directly to us. That's my frustration with a lot of Marxist-Leninism. It's just like even if I took you seriously, even if I believed in everything you're saying about contemporary China and the USSR, etc., there's no way in which me and the socialist core, and the hopefully socialist core, but in the capitalist core right now, could equate conditions that we exist under to those conditions. There's not many parallels, honestly. Like, there's some, but they're vague, and so for me to just go, we can lift that and then apply it now, I'm like, I can come up with orientations and principles and apply now, maybe. Like, I have my theoretical minimum for communism. I think Parker McQueenie, one of you guys, stated something, and I know he got a lot of pushback, but I was like, you know what? That's my theoretical minimum. It's not my belief set, but it's actually like anyone who believes this is at least on the same page as me. Right? Like there's a spectrum of where we can go with this, and I'm probably on a different spectrum than Parker. But like broadly, the only one that's contestable is like, are Marxists always democratic? And I would say no, but in general we try to be. Like so I guess it does kick the Bordigas out because they have this real ingrained hatred of the D word, but nonetheless, I do think it's kind of how we have to be right now. And even people who I think we have to fight against, like there's a lot of the of the kind of social democratic socialist, whatever the fuck they want to call themselves, end of the DSA, which is not in dominance right now, that I do think we have to actively polemicize against. They are still comrades. That's the thing. Like, that's, I think people miss that about some of what I say is like, no, they're still in the realm of our allies, and they probably ultimately want many of the same things as us. To treat them as utter reprobate enemies is a disaster. Like, even if I think they're wrong, even if I think we have to like politically defeat them, like, you know, I don't, that's a different thing than saying, no, you're not socialist, go fuck off. I mean, I do think there has to be a line, but that line should probably be drawn fairly broadly.
I think similar to with regards to the ML thing now, I think you're exactly right, and I think there's a certain directionlessness of movementism that you even see in the last couple of years that affects this. I think a lot of it's too is that you start to read a little bit and you realize that a lot of the things that you were told about the Soviet Union is wrong. A lot of things that you're told about Stalin are wrong. A lot of the things, probably everything that you're told about Cuba is wrong, and then Venezuela is wrong. And then all of a sudden you're utterless. And if you've been lied to by the one side, then like, why wouldn't you just with full embrace cross the Rubicon in that way? And I think that's what a lot of people do. I think they end up very utterless, sort of in the middle of the sea, and you want to be attached to something. You want a historical, I mean, even for the perspective of like personal identity. It feels good to be attached to a historical project and say like, I identify with this. I don't think this doesn't make for very good critical thinking or like historical criticism. You know what I mean? I think it makes a lot of these people stupider. But they're no more guilty of it. I mean, they're extremely guilty of it because of like the severity of the things that they sort of support often. But like, everybody does this. I mean, to a large extent. I mean, I don't think even I or we are like free from like attaching ourselves to certain things for the purpose of identity. And sometimes you kick the can down the road as well. I mean, at least, I mean, I remember one of the things that I used to do when I was younger that I'm very embarrassed by is I've sort of assumed that's like, say as it regards like, like a certain topic or something. I mean, it could really be anything, but especially as it regards economics or something. If I saw that there was a book written about it, then I'd be like, oh, well, someone's figured this out. So like, I can kind of champion this, or I can feel comfortable saying this because somebody figured it out. And then like, you start to read these people, or you follow them on Twitter, and you see just the amount of stupid shit that people believe and say, even people that you've like kind of trust. And you're like, okay, well, maybe I don't need to, put this sort of on my shield when I'm going out and talking about these things. And you become a little bit more reserved with what you think, and what you think is even possible and this sort of stuff. I think that's a distinction has to be made there.
Right. I agree with that. And I think I came out of the most recent experience in researching a lot more sympathetic to social democrats. Not that I totally agree with them, but more to the point of whenever I hear a lot of leftists confidently talk about planning, I really do start to get my hackles up, like, and very skeptical. I think we are far further ahead in our planning capabilities across society than obviously in the 1930s. However, I don't think it's as simple as going from, well, Walmart and Amazon have centrally planned economies. Now we can do that on a national, then international scale. I don't think that's that simple.
No Lee Phillips plus cybernetics equals communism. Equation there. Yeah.
Yeah. And
there's a lot to learn from cybernetic type stuff.
Absolutely.
No,
but,
absolutely,
it comes down to like Lenin's advice to like learn from the capitalists, basically, like, and that's one thing I think the Soviet Union kind of could have done better by being more lenient on the specialists. Like, I really think like the kind of communist conceit that like we can answer every question with Marxism, and the bourgeois specialists are just an obstacle, and we're going to need to get rid of them as soon as possible. And I think that kind of kind of anti-bureaucratic populism. I mean, it does appeal to the more libertarian, anarchistic side of things, but like, I think it was a mistake. I think, technicists in a lot of cases had the right approach of, let's actually like scientifically look at the economy and do real scientific planning.
Yeah.
Also,
No,
the extent of cybernetics veracity in a very losing the idea extremely largely, is like, okay, how much of it is so practical that it's just already implemented by the capitalist world? And the answer to that is quite a bit. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Quite a bit. So
anybody who's worked for a large corporation, anyone.
But I do think cybernetics, can help us kind of understand what planning really is in terms of the idea, like the metaphor that cyberneticists always uses the idea of like the captain of a ship. The captain of a ship isn't single-handedly controlling everything. They're just, reacting to things in certain ways. The whole idea of the whole cybernetic idea of control, I think, really does kind of bring something to questions of planning. I'm not an expert on it. I do find it annoying that a lot of leftists like use that as a silver bullet.
Yeah.
When the reality is like these are political problems.
Right.
We solved through collective democratic decision making and not through just kind of some whiz kid coming out with a brilliant cybernetic theory and implementing it. But
I think the cybernetics is a way around like cancelism and maybe God's plan as it actually exists, but then it pretends that there's an objective answer and that there's not a feedback. And the thing about the cybernetic metaphor, right? You're right about that, but also like it assumes there's an expert setting up the system that's actually in control. It does. It may say it doesn't, but it does. Like, and in that sense, it's interesting. I mean, I do find it interesting that the other thing when people use cybernetics as an answer, they often like skip over the problems of the 80s and 90s. And while it did just get kind of tied to a couple of different things, including software development, because of the crisis of the behavioralist assumptions of the cyberneticist. What I find interesting about it, though, you want to talk about learning from the socialists. We do have to admit that why we got cybernetics was the capitalists learning from the capitalists, but was the capitalists learning from the socialists because they were taking things and Bogdanov and other things that were coming up in the Soviet Union that Gauss plan and the central committees didn't accept, and then running with it in a way that would be useful for capitalist development, right? I mean, there is interestingly still a dialectic in a way between the capitalist and communist world that largely capitalism has been more able to benefit from. It's kind of maddening, actually.
Leontiev, the input output tables, the capitalists got a hold of that, even though it was like a homegrown. Yeah. It's one of the more embarrassing aspects of socialist history is this like really, yeah.
I mean, like the Soviets had a better personal computer than the capitalists, though, but they were so afraid of military secrets they didn't fucking release it. Like it's mad when you start learning that, like the technological history of the Soviet Union. You're just like, man, we were so close to so many things, so many times. Again, it's easy to dismiss that from our concerns now, but they were right to be kind of worried about, like, this is Reagan's America pushing down on them too. Like, this is, when this is really coming to a head. And the Cold War, which had been sort of in detente a little bit in both the Nixon and Carter administration. I mean, Nixon was amping it up and down simultaneously, and so was Carter really too, but nonetheless. It, like, by the time you get into late Reagan, there's absolutely no question that politically the United States wants to bring back the Red Menace again. And so would I have done differently than what the Soviet Union did in regards to their computing technology? I don't know. In hindsight, it's pretty clearly a mistake, but that's in hindsight. That's a different problem. Like,
it's just the reality is that when you're in that position of like always having to play catch up with the West out of its desperation, it creates this culture of paranoia and clamping down and hostility to pluralism and openness, and it creates a lot of the negative characteristics that kind of become then rationalized by ML readings of Marxism.
Right. And I don't I mean obviously people who grew up in the 80s probably remember how the paranoia of the new Red Scare and the ramping up of those. But like so doing research, my MA research on Cuba, I read like some Rand Corporation like basically foreign policy plans, and they're literally calling for turning Cuba into a parking lot. I mean, like that is the level of animosity towards communism in the 1980s.
Yeah,
like they are going on the full offensive.
And they stay that way even after communism falls. Like if you read Rand Corporation stuffs about what they should do to Russia, it's basically balkanize it, so much so that George Kennan and other Cold War ghouls are actually saying, like, dudes, chill out. Like, we don't need
it
to,
is
like...
funny, how much Kennan was pushing back against people more extreme than him.
Right.
Yeah, I read a biography of him a while ago, actually. Actually, no, speaking of the 1980s and the
Kennan's
culture,
a fascinating figure.
yeah, it's I've been reading that book, Aberration in the Heartland of the Real, which is like that big book about Timothy McVeigh and all the conspiracies around him. And it's pretty good so far. It's pretty well researched, and it's not really making any like insane. It's not like Programmed to Kill, which a lot of people who like that book also like, where there's just like these fantastical claims. But it was just kind of talking about the culture in the 1980s when Timothy McVeigh was growing up, and just how all these anti-communist, paranoid movies are being put out, and the right really was going hard on the moral panics and the culture war stuff. It kind of reminds me of today, actually. Like, there really was this just insane anti-communist cultural offensive with really hardline, like, this is the days of Red Dawn, Rocky, like just a lot of militaristic
Rocky
fantasies.
3.
Soldier of Fortune magazine is popular, and
this is my youth, by the way. Like, I remember all this stuff.
Yeah. It's just this very xenophobic, hardline anti-communism was just being like really influential on mass.
And it was still lingering in the 90s too. Like, I remember all the stuff about, like, for example, the plight of homosexuals in Cuba, which is real, but had been undone by like 25 years in Cuba before it was even kind of addressed in the United States by the Supreme Court. Like, so it's just like, yeah, and like Fidel apologized for it, which doesn't make it okay. I'm not saying that, but like that's more than anyone in the U.S. did.
Name a fucking Republican who's willing to apologize for any of the shit that they did 50 years ago. Name one. You know what I mean? The three card trick that's played on stuff like that is so wild. I mean, because they're being clever enough to take a real thing and just exploit the fuck out of it. And it's like, okay, what are in any other context, any of the people talking about something like that do not give a fuck. For any other country, for any other time period, you know what I mean? It's like it's so sneaky. I have like such a personal vendetta against shit like that, and to the exclusion of every positive thing that could be said about someone like Fidel. I mean, it's like that kind of shit burns me up. I mean, I remember even when I was in university, and that would come up. There were kids that the only thing that knew about Fidel Castro is that he was homophobic, and it's like. That is insane. You know what I mean?
Right,
and it's really it puts you in a bad situation because because immediately you have to concede that it's true. But the fucking edifice that's being erected for that to be the singular legacy of somebody like that to American liberals is fucking insane. I mean, it's really effective propaganda.
Right. Well, I think, Cold War liberalism really did try to like create this idea that communism is actually conservative, which is funny because you have people today like that idiot Jackson Hinkle who make that like their whole career as being a conservative communist.
Right. Yeah, we're gonna take. Well, I mean, and what I find interesting about that, Donald, is that's actually a far right trope that, like, going back to Yonke and Kerry Bolton and people.
Yeah.
Who were like,
but it's also people like Karl Popper are kind of making this argument that's like, well, in the collapse of the Soviet bloc, like all these like people like Jeffrey Sachs are going, is like, oh, I can't wait to go in and open these people's minds with all this xenophobia and closed-mindedness and all this conservatism. We're going to open up the market and all this new stuff is going to open their minds and they're going to be, liberal, open-minded people. I mean, there was a real conservatism to the culture, you know, in the East Bloc, and especially, you know, like, I think that kind of conservatism really like reaches its peak with like this high Stalinism and Zhdanov doctrine, and this kind of like, which is quite frankly there is a xenophobia, there is a hostility to Western culture that is essentially xenophobia. Like, it's, you know, not to say that, you know, the West is not victimizing the Soviet Union, they clearly were, but still the kind of like rejection of Western culture en masse, and maybe a few exceptions. It is, you know, essentially a Philistine xenophobia. You know, I mean, I know a lot of people are gonna like give me shit for saying this, but I mean, it's just,
it absolutely is. I mean, there's no way around it, and you can also, the thing is, you can also, you can explain it, but I think the level of kind of like Russophilia that you get in the Zhdanovщина is like, it's embarrassing. You know what I mean?
yeah, like they bring back the table of ranks.
It totally can be explained by the war, but like, also, I mean, it's embarrassing, even the way Zhdanov paints the fracture of Europe, you know, of the imperial versus the democratic powers. I mean, to have the confidence of calling to call like Western European capitalist world imperialist is true, but to call the Eastern Bloc democratic, sort of uniquely in, you know, as, you know, in contrast, is like totally.
You make the case for Czechoslovakia, maybe, but even then, it's like by 68.
No, I mean, it's you know, it's insane. And I think at the time they really did believe the sort of post-Popular Front kind of like People's Democracy strategy would be democratic. And I think genuinely, I think Stalin believed that. It's one of the more naive and kind of cute, you know, kind of aspects.
Yeah, it's one of the times where I wish Stalin was actually more cynical. Like,
well, I mean, I think they really did believe that they were going to do this people's democracy thing, but the geopolitical situation really did like lead to the clampdowns and the enforcement of single party rule in those countries. Like, you know, even like an anti-communist historian like Neimark, who basically says Stalin was genocidal, like he admits, like, yeah, like the Eastern Bloc was not the plan. Like, it was it was formed in reaction to geopolitics.
Yeah, I think this is the crucial takeaway is like, you know, we have to get beyond Stalin bad. I mean, there are times, like I have my historiography of things that I always feel like, well, I understand why they did this, but I wouldn't have done it. The faction ban in 1921, like that's
that's a big one for me too. Like the NEP episode, that was my big conclusion, was like, yeah, the ban on factions really was just a huge mistake, and Lenin. Big fuck up on Lenin's part there. In my opinion.
And I feel like some of the stuff in the Last Testament, if you take it as legitimate, is actually about him realizing that was a fuck up. But you know, there's other ones. I mean, the Sino-Soviet split. The Sino-Soviet split's one that I lose sleep over, because I'm like, okay, on one hand, we have China doing something truly radical and actually trying to live up to visions of communism. No one else has even tried. Like, and on the other hand, they're undermining all other parts of the communist world for like petty geopolitical reasons constantly. Ones that, look, I kind of got why you got to that point, but how do you justify it? Like, particularly like in the 80s, when you're like, we're going to make forays to South Africa to fuck Cuba because they were too nice to the USSR. What the fuck are you doing? Like, are we going to like be really nice to Pinochet because the US wants us to? Also, eventually we're even going to like continue even when we're no longer getting benefits from that. Like it that kind of stuff is really hard for me to like justify.
Yeah.
You know,
that was something that we came to. I mean, doing our Vietnam and Cambodia episodes is just, the Sino-Soviet split was probably one of the most world historic tragedies of the 20th century when you start to really dive into it and realize.
And I mean, I think like, honestly, like, you know, Mao, you know, the way it's presented, it was all about anti-revisionism and like, you know, like, how dare Khrushchev like spit on our legacy like this and insult like Stalin like this? But really, in my opinion, like,
I don't think it has anything to do with that. I just think that's what the
right. I think it had to do with
nukes.
I think a lot of it had to do with the nuclear weapons. because basically the Soviet Union was willing to give economic aid to China, and they did very generous economic aid. But they did not want China to develop its own bomb. They wanted to maintain control over the bomb. And China basically saw that as like Russian chauvinism. It's like basically saying, like, we're the leaders of the world communist movement, you're secondhand partners. Like, you're not actually a sovereign government with its own standing in the communist movement. You're basically just going to be a junior partner to the Soviets, because you're not going to, so there's this kind of identification of, actually having their own A-bomb with sovereignty. And so what happens is Mao does the Sino-Soviet split and then launches the Great Leap Forward to industrialize enough to get an A-bomb. And it's very brutal, and the human cost is pretty intense, but it does work. And then, you could even go as far to argue about the Cultural Revolution. The main thing that it accomplishes is getting rid of any remaining Soviet influence in the country, which in a way kind of opens the door to, the complete, reversal of Maoism.
Yeah, although it does lead to like the integration of like white collar, blue collar, and peasant groups in ways that I think is also underplayed. Like, there are positive things to the Cultural Revolution.
Yeah. I don't mean to totally dismiss the Cultural Revolution. Like, I think there was positive stuff going on, but I agree with you. Really negative stuff that I think a lot of people who romanticize the Cultural Revolution are just way too blasé about. Like, there was, and I just think there was.
There's ethnic conflict that got unleashed that wasn't control at all. I mean, a lot of that happened in Russia too, but it happened probably more in China. There's also the removal of like anybody with any sympathies towards even old Marxist Leninist Bolshevism, and it's not even dealing with the early purges of the party in China. Everyone thinks it's funny when people tell me like, well, the Communist Party of China, which Mao was the first leader of, and I'm like, what are you on? Like, there's like several sets of leaders before you get to Mao being in charge, dude. I know that a couple of them are persona non grata now, but China's a harder case, and it's hard to deal with politically also today, because I tend to be both a defensist of it, but also like when people read it to me as like trying to do this grand anti-imperialist socialist project, I'm like, what evidence do you actually have for that? Like, the Belt and Road Initiative kind of, but even that's been massively scaled back in the past 2 or 3 years. So I'm going to defend it against Western imperialism, and I think also that any socialist political grouping in a Western country should have as their number one orientation is to try to repair any Western socialist relations to China, and to like demilitarize relations as absolutely as much as possible for the sake of the planet.
Stopping war with China is going to be an incredibly important political task for U.S. socialists, in my opinion.
Absolutely, I think it's like general anti-militarism is going to be a huge thing, and it's going to be hard because it seems to be the thing that the Social Democrats are in theory in support of us on, but when you actually get them into power, they do absolutely nothing about. So it's like it's hard to say what that would look like. And yeah, I think we can get there. I don't want to get too much into contemporary geopolitics, because that's where I tend to make everybody angry by saying stuff like, multipolarity is fine and it's also inevitable, but it really matters how we organize that multipolar world as to whether or not it's going to lead to a bunch of fucking wars.
Right.
Like we can have a multipolar world where America's still bombing the shit out of half the planet. And someone like John Mearsheimer doesn't care if we are either. And I think that's something that we have to deal with. But I also think in some ways that's an overcorrection from I think, Donald, you may disagree with me, but in the aughts, and particularly between the two Bernie campaigns, it seemed like international policy was something leftists just forgot about, like entirely. Like you're just like, we're not even talking about that. Like other than opposing Trump starting a war somewhere, we don't care. Like
no, I think it's kind of true. I think it was very much kind of fringe. Like it was really only like the kind of fringe ML groups that were really like kind of focusing on anti-war stuff, honestly. Like, you know, in a lot of ways, like, you know, in a lot of ways, the kind of red-brown stuff we see today is kind of a result of like left-wing anti-imperialists kind of becoming more fringe and having to look for allies in unsavory places, you know.
Yep.
Which is how you end up kind of with you know, some of the gray zone people working with people associated with Falun Gong, apparently, like, you know, just very
like the answer group, the coalition. They're kind of like, I sort of associate them with that sort of thing where it's like I just always hear like kind of like gray zone and
answer. I will give them credit as they've kind of distanced themselves from the more like LaRouche oriented anti-war movement.
To be honest, I kind of give a lot of those people credit for just sticking it out.
Right.
I mean, it's
tough.
also
I think the debate about Syria
to be a kind of a peacenik Stalinist is also so weird because it's like no one is buying it. You know what I mean? It's like that's the hardest position to be in. It's like I'm anti-war at all costs. I hate like you know, suffering and stuff, but like, you know, long live Comrade Stalin. It's like very, you paint yourself into a corner there. And even though I understand, it's like, you know, it's tough. That's
that's
a really tough sell. Although ironically, Stalin is like the biggest peacenik of all time. Like all of that James Harris book is so funny because like
Stalin was peace at any cost in a lot of ways. Yeah.
He was like, always trying to get some kind of treaty with somebody.
No, Stalin did not like war. He was good at war. He became good at it at least, but he wasn't like looking to get into wars. You know.
Well, it's very hard to like progress your revolution and do a world revolution and fight a bunch of defensive wars all at the same time. I don't know. Right. Maybe it will exhaust your society, kill a large portion of the men, and then like you'll have problems later.
One part I was seeing was just like how many people just like went insane because they were so traumatized by having to live through like the Civil War and all this stuff.
God, I read this. It's a reactionary Russian thinker, not almost a friend of this guy named Dmitry Orlov, but he actually did like make that very clear in his book about collapse. It was like, I mean, we went through the Civil War, which we went through immediately after getting out of World War I. Then we had the Great Patriotic War. Then we had the Cold War. Then we almost went to war with the Chinese. Then we almost went to war with the Americans multiple times. Like it's
Afghanistan, you know.
Yeah. Then we go to Afghanistan. Right. It is just like it's like, I get why they were war exhausted, honestly. like even the United States, who has been at war like almost all of my lifetime. It has figured out a way to do war that involves so little of the population that we don't get war exhaustion. Like that's part of how they get away with it.
What's the stakes of any U.S. war as compared to like the Civil War or oh my God, World War II? I mean, World War II from the point of view of a fucking like anybody on in the East and the Soviet Union is like total fucking describable apocalypse that like just nobody in the United States has ever even fucking like is impossible to even consider. You know what I mean? Even for just like the average European, it's so fucking traumatic. You know, all the displacement stuff, but for the Slavs, Christ, I mean, it's like so insane. And it's like you have like without understanding that there's no way you can ever understand anything that have to do with Russia or the Soviet Union post-war. I mean, it's like really is probably the singular thing to understand, and there is not, you know, there is no American equivalent. Not even
the Civil War is the closest thing we have to it, and that's not the same. I mean, like
even that's a drop in the bucket, and it's like it's crazy.
No, I can only imagine the level of trauma because I'm a U.S. trained historian, So, or Latin America and U.S. trained. So, it's studying Soviet history has been sort of out of my wheelhouse. But one of the things that I can tell you, studying trauma across the beginning of the 20th century to the middle of the 20th century, there is a reason why in the post-war years that there's this turn inward into the focus of looking at individual family units and focusing on raising children and all that you associate with the baby boom, because when you have literally gone through, obviously we were not fighting with, there was no conflict in the United States. Men were sent off to die in both cases, right? Oftentimes partners abandoned. Then you were interrupted in the interwar years with the Great Depression. And I think people do have they forget just how deprivating it was for people. So you have this turn towards, focusing on internal development that you have in the post-war years because of just how traumatized people are. And there's part of the reason why, like, let's say the Red Scare and McCarthyism was so effective, because it was an appeal to another menace that could then lead to war later. So let's amplify that trauma, another tenfold, and you can then only imagine what was going on in the Soviet Union.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, the only society that I think it has a similar claim to coming out of that kind of trauma and intensity is actually the Chinese, frankly, because I was looking at from like the Taiping Rebellion to the Chinese Communist Civil War. It's like, oh wow, the death scares in these the death stats are like, okay, the Taiping versus the U.S. Civil War. U.S. Civil War is bloodiest war per capita of U.S. history by far, by like an order of magnitude, actually. And the Taiping by itself, 6 times that. It's just the scale of that. Like, we don't have in our history, except for the indigenous here, and even then, it's actually probably the pox that you have that's that bad. The pox in the Indian Wars, anything like that death scale, and definitely not with people who we identify with. And that is, I don't think you can underestimate that. I don't want to sound like a namby-pamby liberal about trauma, but I do think you actually have to deal with that when you're trying to, like, why was it so violent? Because one of the things that I also think about when we talk about, like, not so much the purges, but definitely the Red Terror, it's like, well, yeah, but like the SRs, and I'm sympathetic to the SRs in a lot of ways, the left SRs. Yeah, but the left SRs and the Narodniks in 1 year killed 9,000 people, right? Like, and just terrorist attacks. That's like general society is just that violent. I don't know what we like. This is not to say that I think even all the Red Terror was okay, but like, I'm just, when I look at that, I'm like, well, how, like, I know how the Cheka got to where it got. I don't know how, like, what do you do? Like, and yet I also agree with you guys back. I also think that a lot of the trends that bring it all down actually start in this time period. So it's like, that's where I'm torn. Like, I don't have a good answer for these problems. Like, it does lead me to think that since we have the ability not to start off from a place of that much social violence, that maybe we shouldn't, like, that maybe we should not be valorizing violence like that.
Oh, yeah, I definitely agree very strongly with that. I think, it's one of the ultimate traits of an infantile leftist is valorizing violence and just making empty threats of violence to people they politically disagree with, and, just stuff like that. I just think
guillotine means they're cool for about 5 minutes until you
right. I think like a lot of people's idea of like what a revolutionary is like this weather underground, like Red Army faction type understanding where it's like who's willing to pick up a gun and fight the state now versus do reformism or whatever. It's just not how Marxists have thought about these things.
Not historically, at least not before the 70s. Although, I always my pushback to that is always like, well, who did the rather underground mostly kill, my dudes? Themselves. Like, they were very good at blowing themselves up by accident. Like that's what they actually accomplished. And Red Army faction, they killed some more people than themselves, but a lot of themselves. Yeah, so it's something to think about when I see these things. Like for example, when you see like Americans LARPing Galonzoism, and you're like, please don't kill anybody, please just don't kill anybody. Like historically speaking, you guys kill someone and it goes real bad. And also don't form a sex cult, that'd be great. And yeah, I mean, those things are more than embarrassing. They're discrediting. So, and on that note, thank you guys so much for coming in. People should check out your recent series. When are they coming out on Cosmopod on the NEP?
I was muted. I think 2 weeks from now, I think, is the plan.
Okay. Sweet.
So
by the time this is released, this will be concurrent to your thing on the NEP. So
sweet. Well, it's gonna be the bonus episode.
All right. So thank you guys for coming on, and we're going to. And before I end, though, anything else you guys want to plug?
Cosmonaut's got a new book out, Fight the Constitution. Oh, you got your copy.
Hey, hell yeah.
So, yeah, get a copy. And I wrote the preface, but it's got essays from all different members of MUG who also wrote for Cosmonaut. And if you want to learn about, a political vision for socialism and the United States today, it is something that is out there. It's not perfect, it's not complete, but it is a start. So yeah.
Awesome.
And also thank you for having us on, Varn.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
I guess I'll if I could do an individual plug, I should have one of my last articles as a academic coming out soon. If for University of Illinois Press, in a book on labor organizing and the working class during the pandemic.
All right. Kristen, playing guitar anywhere?
Yeah, just playing music in Brooklyn. I don't know if it's worth plugging too much, but if y'all want to come see me play jazz, I live in Brooklyn. I play jazz guitar.
All right.
You should go see him if you can. He's very good.
Yeah, please contribute to my lifestyle.
Yeah,
by all means.
All right. Well, every good socialist movement has at least one petite bourgeois deviationist. So as I am myself, since I run a fucking podcast.
Me and Christian love that petty bourgeois formalist deviationism.
So,
yeah, but Donald and I definitely teeter on bohemian socialism.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much. Have a great day.